Over the last century, we have witnessed exemplary leadership in the Catholic Church. Popes who have shone for their holiness, their social vision, and their profound humility, guiding millions with an inspiring light. Recent memory brings us images of truly exceptional pontiffs. However, history whispers a different tune. Over the course of 2 millennia, the sacred throne of St. Peter was not always occupied by pure souls. There were periods when the Vicar of Christ failed to live up to such a sublime calling. More concerned with earthly power than the salvation of souls, his actions were tinged with greed, lust, relentless revenge, and a pride that overshadowed any trace of piety. Who were these popes who tarnished the Church's glorious legacy? What do their scandalous lives reveal about human nature and the incredible resilience of an institution that has outlived its own ghosts? Welcome to Catholicism in Focus. Today we'll lift the veil on history's most controversial popes. 1. Stephen VI, the Trial of the Corpse. We open our tour through the shadows of the papacy with a man whose brief but brutal reign left an indelible stain, Pope Stephen VI. His pontificate, which barely lasted between 896 and 897, was seared into the collective memory by an act of revenge so twisted it seems like something out of the darkest fiction, the infamous Cadaveric Synod. Stephen VI was obsessed with his predecessor, Pope Formosus, whom he accused of usurping the throne. Not even Formosus's death could appease his anger. In an unprecedented act, Stephen VI ordered Formosus's corpse, already in an advanced state of decomposition, to be exhumed, dressed in papal robes, and seated on the throne of the Basilica of St. John Lateran for a posthumous trial. Formosus's lifeless body was formally charged with perjury and illegally occupying the chair of Peter. With no possibility of defense, he was found guilty, his decrees annulled, and the 3 fingers of his right hand, those of papal blessing, were amputated. Finally, his desecrated body was dragged through the streets of Rome and mercilessly thrown into the Tiber River. This act of desecration and madness deeply outraged the Roman population. A few months after this infamous spectacle, the disgusted people of Rome seized and imprisoned him. His end was as violent as his reign. He was found strangled in his prison. His short-lived pontificate is a grim reminder of how obsession and hatred can drag even the most sacred figures into barbarism. 2. John XII, the hedonistic pope. The history of the papacy teaches us that absolute power in the wrong hands can be devastating. Our next protagonist, John XII, epitomizes this lesson. He ascended to the papal throne in 955 at the astonishingly young age of around 18. His pontificate would become a chronicle of scandal, dissipation, and a shameful dereliction of all spiritual duty, a far cry from the ideal of a pastor of souls. The Lateran Palace, the venerable papal seat, was converted under his regency into a house of vice, a place of sumptuous banquets, riotous orgies, and incessant gambling. John XII showed almost complete disinterest in his ecclesiastical duties. He rarely celebrated Mass or administered the sacraments. He lived like a secular prince, given to hunting, amorous affairs, and political intrigue. His conduct was so obscene that contemporary chronicles paint him in the darkest light, and some sources suggest that the famous legend of Pope Joan may have arisen or gained traction during his reign because of his licentious behavior. His morality, or lack thereof, provoked a drastic response. The Emperor Otto I, tired of the depravity degrading the See of Peter, intervened directly. John XII was deposed at a synod, although he attempted a violent comeback. His life, marked by lust and violence, came to an end as scandalous as his reign. He died after receiving a blow to the head while in bed with a married woman. An ignominious end for a pontiff who dragged the name of the Church into the depths of depravity, marking a vivid example of the saeculum obscurum. 3. Benedict IX, the Pope who sold his throne. It seems that history's lessons about young and ambitious popes were slow to sink in. Less than a century after the debacle of John XII, the throne of St. Peter was occupied by another teenager, Benedict IX. He ascended to the papacy around 1032 and his reign was not only a disaster, but is considered by many to be the most infamous pontificate in the history of the Church. His record is a compendium of greed, instability, and a cynicism rarely seen. Benedict IX holds the dubious record of being the only man in history to have been pope on 3 separate occasions. His first election was a clear and brazen act of simony, the practice of buying and selling church offices. The immense wealth and influence of his powerful family, the Counts of Tusculum, literally bought the position for him. His first pontificate was an era of chaos and debauchery, marked by accusations of multiple adulteries and murders. He was a tyrant who terrorized the Roman population with his dissolute life and the violence of his supporters. The popular disgust led to his expulsion from Rome, and in his place, the anti-pope Sylvester III was elected in 1045. But Benedict IX did not give up. Months later, with the military backing of his family, he returned in triumph to the Eternal City, ousted Sylvester III, and reclaimed his throne by force. What happened next is almost unbelievable. In an act of total disinterest in the office, and perhaps under pressure, Benedict IX decided to sell the papacy. In 1045, he ceded the papal title to his godfather, John Gratian, for a considerable sum of money. John Gratian thus became Pope Gregory VI. This was a monumental scandal, but Benedict IX's ambition seemed to know no bounds. Despite having auctioned the pontificate, he attempted a comeback a 4th time, creating a chaotic situation in 1046, with 3 simultaneous popes claiming legitimacy. This papal anarchy was unsustainable. The crisis was finally resolved by the energetic intervention of the Holy Roman Emperor, Henry III, who, horrified by the state of the papacy, called the Synod of Sutri in 1046, where all 3 popes were deposed. The figure of Benedict IX is a sad reflection of a dark period where the papacy was more a political spoil for noble families than a sacred spiritual office. 4th, Boniface VIII, the defiant sovereign pope. Boniface VIII, 1294 to 1303, stands in history as a colossus of ambition and controversy, a brilliant jurist and a ruthless politician. Although the legends and propaganda of his many enemies magnified some of his alleged atrocities, there is no doubt that he was a power-hungry man with an explosive temper and an iron will to assert papal supremacy over any temporal power. His pontificate took place at a crucial moment when European nation-states were beginning to consolidate their authority and challenge papal hegemony, marking the beginning of the end of the medieval era of theocratic power. One of his most notorious conflicts was with the powerful Roman Colonna family, who boldly questioned the legitimacy of his election. Boniface VIII did not hesitate to resort to military force. He besieged the city of Palestrina, a Colonna fiefdom, and despite its peaceful surrender, he ordered its total destruction, plowing it up and sowing salt on its ruins as an act of symbolic revenge. This act of extreme cruelty was a clear indication of his implacable determination. But his most celebrated confrontation, and the one that would mark a turning point in relations between church and state, was with King Philip IV of France, nicknamed the Fair Five. Urban VI. When the election of a single pope can tear the church in 2 or even 3 rival factions, his name is etched in the annals of infamy. Urban VI is that pontiff. His election in 1378, following the death of Gregory XI, was not just a political event, but the catalyst for one of the deepest and most enduring crises in the history of the Western Church, the Great Western Schism. The election of Urban VI, on 1378 to 1389, occurred in an atmosphere of extreme tension. After the brief return of the Avignon papacy to Rome, the conclave was held under intense pressure from the Roman people, who feared that the mostly French cardinals would elect another pope who would return to the comfort of Avignon. The crowd, with its cries of Roman or Italian pope, decisively influenced the election of Bartholomew Prignano, Archbishop of Bari, who took the name Urban VI. However, Urban VI soon revealed an authoritarian, irascible, and, to many, tyrannical temperament. He was a reformer, yes, but with brutal methods. He fiercely criticized the opulence and corruption of the cardinals, many of whom were accustomed to the luxury of the Avignon court. His direct attacks and intransigence quickly alienated most of the cardinals who had elected him. He, an Italian, did not hesitate to call his own cardinals imbeciles and traitors, generating deep resentment. These cardinals, feeling threatened, humiliated, and arguing that Urban VI's election had not been free, declared his election void and proceeded to elect an anti-pope, Robert of Geneva, who took the name Clement VII. 6. Alexander VI, Borgia, and Leo X, Medici. Papal luxury and decadence. There are popes whose names have become synonymous with intrigue, opulence, and unbridled ambition. We are referring to Alexander VI, the Borgia, and the ostentatious Leo X, the Medici. Separated by barely a decade at the beginning of the turbulent 16th century, the two pontiffs epitomized an era in which the papacy was immersed in the splendor and intrigue of the Renaissance. Coming from the most prominent and powerful dynasties of the time, they used the throne of St. Peter not only to rule the church, but to expand and consolidate the power, wealth, and influence of their respective family houses. The church's resources flowed endlessly to finance wars, political conspiracies, and extravagant and sumptuous lifestyles. Alexander VI, 1492 to 1503, born Rodrigo Borgia, is remembered for his riotous personal life. Before and during his pontificate, he kept numerous mistresses and fathered several children, the most notorious of which were Cesare Borgia and Lucrezia Borgia, figures who each had their own stories of boundless ambition, political cruelty, and moral scandals. His papacy was an explosive mix of blatant nepotism, promoting his sons to high office, ruthless political intrigue, and a moral laxity that scandalized much of Christendom. 7. Paul IV, the shadow of the ghetto. While some pontiffs left a legacy of personal scandal or boundless ambition, others distinguished themselves by their ideological intransigence and religious fanaticism. Among the latter, the shadowy figure of Pope Paul IV stands out. Although he perhaps wished to be remembered for his zeal in the Counter-Reformation or his fight against heresy, his most lasting legacy, and the most shameful, is his relentless anti-Semitism and the systematic persecution of the Jewish community. Born Gian Pietro Carafa, Paul IV, 1555 to 1559, was a man of stern temperament, a rigid theologian, and a born inquisitor. He ascended the papal throne at the ripe old age of 79, and his pontificate was characterized by an implacable determination to purify the church and eradicate any form of heresy or moral laxity. However, his zeal led him to extremes of intolerance that we find abominable today. In 1555, just 2 months after his election, Paul IV issued one of the most damaging and cruelly discriminatory papal bulls in history, Cum Nimis Absurdum. This document was not only a direct attack on the Jewish community, but also laid the legal groundwork for systematic and humiliating persecution that would continue for centuries in the Papal States. The bull ordered the forced creation of a Jewish ghetto in Rome, a fenced and isolated space where Jews were forced to live, with gates that locked at nightfall. 8. Beyond the shadows, the resilience of faith. Throughout history, we've explored shameful chapters in the history of the pontiffs. And for those wondering, no, the history of the Catholic Church records no pope named Leo XIV. The numbering of the Leos goes all the way back to the 13th. These stories are not meant to denigrate, but rather to remind us that, despite the most atrocious human errors, rampant corruption, and the failings of its leaders, the Church has managed to endure for 2 millennia. It has faced heresies, schisms, external sieges, and even the unbridled ambition and depravity of some of its own pastors. The scandals we have reviewed today are undeniable testimony to the inherent fallibility of human nature, even when clothed in the highest spiritual authority. They demonstrate that power, if not exercised with the deepest humility, the greatest responsibility, and a true vocation for service, can corrupt even those who are supposedly closest to the divine. And yet, despite all these trials and tribulations, the Church persists. The gates of hell have not prevailed over the Church. It is painful, yes, to delve into these great disappointments and dark chapters that fill us with shame and perplexity. Our faith lies in the unchanging and perfect holiness of Christ himself. He is the true rock upon which our faith is built, the unshakable foundation that has allowed the Church to withstand the fiercest storms, including those that, sadly, have come from within. The history of the popes, in all its complexity, its lights and shadows, invites us to humility in the face of human fragility, to critical discernment, and to unwavering hope in divine guidance. It teaches us that the Church, in its essence, is a mystery of the divine and the human, and that its capacity to survive despite its weaknesses is, for believers, a tangible sign of its supernatural origin. These stories prompt us to reflect on the immense responsibility of power, the vital importance of personal integrity, and the constant need for renewal and reform within any institution, especially one with such a transcendent mission. Which other pontiffs do you think, due to their decisions or conduct, should be analyzed in future videos? How do you think these stories from the past can shed light on the challenges of the present? Leave your comments, participate respectfully in the conversation, and let's continue exploring together the fascinating, complex, and sometimes disturbing history of the Catholic Church.